Good afternoon, class. This is John. Checking in with you. I apologize for getting to this a little bit later in the afternoon than I had intended to. I am going to be making some comments here about Bill Cronon, and we got off to a little bit of a start with him in class, but I want to try to talk about him as one of the major environmental, three of the four major environmental historians that we'll be covering together this quarter. We're of course laying the groundwork, and we're looking at different levels of analysis that our four environmental historians look at when they look at different historical periods, particularly with regard to the natural environment and the relationship that we humans as a species have with our natural environment. And please bear with me. It might seem a little bit, it might be sort of slow for some of these lenses or levels of analysis to really kick in for you, but I am going to keep reinforcing them, and hopefully by the end of next week you'll start to have a pretty strong sense of how the levels of analysis that Donald Worster applies versus those of Jared Diamond versus those of William Cronon versus those of tomorrow Carolyn Merchant. So today we're going to try to finish out our conversation regarding Bill Cronon. And we spent a little time in class today discussing amongst ourselves sort of our own levels of comfort with this idea that maybe history isn't always simply about the facts and the absolute truth of what has happened in the past. To what degree are we comfortable with the idea that history is a story, and the way that we tell the story about the past sort of provides us with a way of thinking about our present and our future? I have to say my bias is that I think we as humans are sort of hardwired to think in terms of stories and narratives, and that's why people would rather take a history class with an instructor who tells stories as opposed to one who just spews dates and facts, even if perhaps those dates and facts might be more factual and correct than the stories told by another. Anyway, if you want to talk to me more about that at some point, I'll happily indulge the subject. So, how do we think of the past as something that might be used? So parables or lessons are a huge part of what Bill Cronon is after when he looks at the past, and particularly when he looks at the past of how humans have interacted with their natural environment. He believes that the past does for us something that can be very valuable, the stories that we come up with about the past. His hope, I think, is that by telling stories about the past and our relationship with the environment, that it will hopefully engender or impart to us a sense of humility, that we aren't necessarily perhaps as in control as we may have led ourselves to believe. The human race, which has developed things like the atomic bomb and has developed things like Kleenex and duct tape, those are perhaps fantastic achievements, but are they ultimately more powerful or more consequential than the natural environment and the natural forces that exist around us? Can they make up for dirty air or dirty water? Who knows? But these are some of the questions and concerns that Cronon concerns himself with. So a couple questions on this slide. Can history be used to serve a purpose? We talked about this a little bit. But that second question is the one I want to concern ourselves with now. Do you have a static view of nature? And static is perhaps a fancy term, but in other words, it could be thought of as, do you have a fixed view of nature? For you, is nature something that stays the same and has always been the way that it is now? It's a pretty easy way of thinking or pattern of thinking to slip into, right? To think of nature as it's always been. It was once great, and those parts that humans haven't come in too great of contact with, they remain great, but the parts that humans have come in contact with, those are entering on a steady decline, downward slope. Well, if we look at that's a tempting way of thinking about nature, but if we If we look down, look at it more closely, we realize, nature is actually in a constant state of change itself. We have seasons. For most parts of the world, the seasons bring change. We have natural ebbs and flows, right? Even our climate has varied ever so slightly throughout the past, tens of thousands of years. There has been some variation. If you look at a forest, there are trees that are constantly dying, and there are trees that are constantly growing up to replace those that have died. So there is actually a change. Ecologists would probably refer to this as homeostasis, the idea of stability through change, meaning it's through the death of some trees that the life of new trees takes place. Similarly with animals and the habitat that animals make of the forest vegetation that they find. Okay, so we have to be a little mindful of our own sort of perhaps errors of thinking about our natural environment. Our natural environment is not this simply static thing. But in many of the parables or stories that historians tell about our natural environment, it seems as though nature was this wonderful, perfect, balanced place. But even nature has undergone tremendous change throughout its own natural history, but then, of course, alongside the human era of our history as well, once humans started to interact with it. Okay, so Cronon's approach, well, among the stories we might be tempted to tell, there are some examples here. Environmental historians, who, as Cronon has already indicated, oftentimes tend to be environmentalists as well. Environmental historians oftentimes fall into something of a predictable pattern of telling the story of our natural environment as one that was perfect, but then it came in contact with human capitalism and it began a trajectory of decline. A fancy word for that is actually declensionist. We can tell a declensionist story. A declensionist story is one that goes boop and crashes. It's a story of decline. And most often in those stories there's this idea of a golden age. There was a time when nature was perfect and balanced and wonderful, and then along comes humankind and the axe and the saw and the chainsaw and the lumber mill, and suddenly nature has been destroyed or ruined. Cronon likes to distinguish between something that is, I think, useful for us. The idea of natural time being a cyclical sort of a process that tends to revisit itself, right? The seasons, the growth, the life cycle of salmon, these tend to happen in a cyclical, fairly predictable way. But then there's human time, which, if you hear particularly Americans of the 20th and 21st century tell it, it's a story of linear progression. And it's progress, it's upward. We're always getting better, right? Each generation is bigger, faster, stronger, and smarter than the last, so on and so forth. He's concerned about this. He's concerned about how we sometimes lose track of our different concepts of time. Truth being told, human time isn't always linear, and it isn't always an improvement, right? Different civilizations have declined in very significant ways. But what is more powerful is the natural sort of cyclical time frame, or the cyclical shape, the circular shape, or the progressive linear climb? It's a question that I think Cronon is trying to ask in his work. In the Umatilla Basin, could you make a case for how time is constructed in the experience of salmon over the past 200 years? What would that diagram look like? To what degree is it a natural, cyclical timeline? To what degree is it a linear timeline, and maybe one that goes like this, and then maybe back up? Maybe it's boop, 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 along with salmon numbers. Probably depends on what it is that you're paying attention to. If it's the number of salmon in the various migration runs, that could be, you could try to do that. So we have to sort of ask ourselves, when we look back at time, what point in time are we charting progress from? Because if we look back at 1800, we're probably going to wind up telling a story about salmon that is a little blip upward at the end, and then where are we going? Who knows? But if we tell a story that starts in the 1920s, we'll probably tell a story that's down here and heading up, because there is a mild recovery taking place. These are the kinds of questions that Cronon's after. What is our concept of time, and what is our concept of nature? If we come up with too flawed of a concept of either of those, it can really distort the story that we tell. And if we distort the story that we tell, maybe that's okay. Maybe we're telling the story for a particular purpose. Maybe we want to call people's attention to salmon, and so we're going to look at, starting in 1800, what they looked like and what human-based agriculture did to those populations. But we need to be aware of that, right? We need to know that, okay, we're telling a story, and the telling of that story is very much determined by where we start and what our concept is of the nature from which we have fallen, or from which we are climbing up from. I hope I'm being somewhat clear here with this. Okay, so here are a couple phrases you might stop and just see how you could do in answering these. All human history has a natural context. So we have to take account, as we will when we move through this course. Different periods in human history experienced a different backdrop of the natural environment. We want to be familiar with that. Neither nature nor culture is static, meaning we can't come up with a golden age. As humans, we might tend to think of the 50s as this perfect time, right, where all children had two parents, and families didn't have to work so hard, so one parent, usually the mom, could stay home and keep a really neat house, and they could take care of the children and make lunches and so on and so forth. Well, that's one version of thinking of the 50s as a golden age. But how about civil rights? It was before the civil rights movement. If you're an African American, you probably experienced life really difficult in the 1950s. Similarly, if you were a woman, perhaps you would have felt like you were put upon by cultural expectations of your time that didn't necessarily allow all women to be the kind of people that they wished to be. Okay? Neither culture nor nature is static. We can't ascribe golden ages really to either very easily. Historical wisdom usually comes in the form of parables. We have to tease out the story to find its meaning, and stories have the power to change our perceptions, but it's usually history, or history comes in the form of a parable of story that we then have to interpret into a specific policy recommendation. Policy recommendations aren't exciting to read about. They aren't compelling narratives, but they can come from compelling narratives that force us or challenge us to act in new and important ways. So in closing here, I want to talk a little bit about how stories could apply to our umatilla salmon in the American West. And for example, one of the ways that we assign a story and cultural value to the land, in this case salmon, a tribe might say, salmon are an important part of a story of the health of the natural world. When they go away, we are not as healthy. They are trying to communicate to us that the world is not right. You can see how that's a powerful parable or story. It's both a lesson and a story. For farmers, they might say, we're making the desert bloom. We're taking what was not productive, we're transforming it. We are sort of creating a miracle of sorts. Another powerful parable or story. For government, we are being efficient. I'm just going to click these because we're running out of time. These are all examples. Government, American consumers, stories we tell.